A camera flashes inside a German camp during World War II. American prisoners smile, clean uniforms, bright faces, but something feels wrong. Those pictures soon circle the world, changing how millions see the war. Were they signs of mercy or part of the greatest deception ever staged? 1944, Germany. They were photographs meant to calm the world. Men in uniforms sit at tables. Plates of food rest before them. Faces appear relaxed. The captions say they are treated with care. The images move quickly. Newspapers in neutral countries print them. Families across the ocean breathe easier. But the pictures were a plan. They were shaped by a man who believed pictures could rewrite truth. He was Dr. Ernst Volkmann, a psychologist turned propagandist. He called his work a test of perception. To him, a stage smile could quiet 1,000 protests. He studied faces and angles. He knew how a single frame could steer a conversation. The place was Stalag IX-B. One man used by the cameras was Michael Archer. He was from Ohio. He served as an airman. His face appeared in several spreads. It would travel home and soften the picture of enemy cruelty. The staging was careful. Sick men were kept out of view. Inspectors saw clean sections. A makeshift dining area was set for visitors. Cameras captured moments that lasted only minutes. Volunteers or selected men stood where they would be seen. Each detail was chosen to suggest normalcy. Michael remembered the day. Guards named men to stand. They were offered the best meal in weeks. A photographer circled. Short instructions were given. Smile, the men were told. The camera clicked and the men held the pose. The flash felt like a demand. For a few breaths, the world watched. For many, a smile became a currency. It bought a little food. It bought a quieter night. It bought silence from those who could punish them later. Refusal brought severe consequences. Men learned to perform the hope that others would see. The act of smiling became part of survival. Behind the stage scenes, a different rule governed the camp. Cleaned rooms returned to order after visitors left. Beds that were neat for the camera became rough again. Extra food was shared in secret. For Michael, the smile stayed on only for the photograph. It did not erase the weight he carried when the lights dimmed. The images served a wider aim. Germany wanted to show a gentler face. The regime hoped to soften critics and confuse reports. If the world believed prisoners were treated well, questions about cruel treatment would weaken. Each photograph became a small tool in a larger campaign. Propaganda works not by force alone, but by bending belief. News reached the United States slowly. Relieved letters appeared in some homes. For a moment, a smiling son or brother replaced fear. That mattered in towns across America. Families held to hope. The photographs shaped quiet conversations at kitchen tables. People studied them and felt a short relief. Yet, not everyone trusted the photographs. A few analysts noticed odd details. The same chair showed up in different pictures. The same pattern on a blanket repeated. Faces wore the same look in frames taken days apart. Those repetitions hinted the images were constructed. Later, those hints would grow into a thread of doubt. Michael kept doubts quiet. He thought of his mother reading a paper at breakfast. He imagined her pause at his face. He imagined her comfort. He also knew the truth he would not say. The camera had frozen a lie into many pages. The lie traveled farther than any report. It taught Michael a new endurance. The opening image that the world saw was perfect. The reality inside the camp would tell another story. Those two stories would press against each other. One would be lived by men who could not speak freely. The other would be argued over by governments and newspapers. In that tension, a war over truth began. It would move from rows of cameras to the desks of analysts. It would test the limits of trust, and it would turn a single smile into a question everyone learned to ask. By 1943, the war had become more than a battle of armies. It had become a battle of minds. Both sides knew that fear and hope could travel faster than any bullet, and the one who controlled the story could control the will to fight. Propaganda turned into a weapon, silent, persuasive, and invisible. Germany, facing mounting losses on every front, began to see the power of illusion as its last remaining strength. In offices hidden deep within Berlin, men like Dr. Ernst Volkmann designed campaigns meant to reshape how the world saw them. The idea was simple. If the enemy believed that German camps were fair and humane, then doubt would grow inside American homes. Doubt weakened resolve. Doubt made people question their leaders. And doubt, Volkmann believed, could slow an entire war effort. This was the birth of a plan they called Operation Truth. It was not truth at all, but an elaborate stage meant to trick the world. Prisoners of war became unwilling actors, and camps became movie sets. The Germans arranged visits by the Red Cross, but every detail was rehearsed. Healthier prisoners were moved to the front, food rations increased for a day, and guards were told to behave like caretakers. When the inspectors left, the illusion disappeared, but the reports they carried home were carefully shaped. Those reports would later inspire the propaganda photos that showed Michael Archer and his fellow prisoners smiling through their fear. The strategy worked, at least for a time. Neutral nations reprinted German claims of humane treatment. Some journalists even described the camps as orderly and respectful. Behind these words was a powerful system of censorship. Letters from prisoners were rewritten before they ever left the camps, stripped of any mention of hardship. To the world outside, the prisoners appeared safe. The deception was clean, effective, and calculated. But propaganda was not one-sided. Across the Atlantic, the United States and its allies understood that morale could win or lose wars just as easily as weapons could. Allied planes carried leaflets instead of bombs, dropping them over German towns and trenches. The messages promised that Allied victory was near, urging soldiers to surrender or civilians to question their leaders. Both sides fought not only to conquer land, but to conquer belief. Historical records later showed how far this invisible war had spread. In one case, the Germans invited foreign journalists to visit Stalag IX-B, presenting it as a model camp. Cameras rolled as prisoners walked freely within marked boundaries, waving to reporters. No one outside that fence saw what happened afterward. When the journalists returned home, the reports echoed Volkmann's vision. Germany's war was civilized, its soldiers humane. This was the landscape in which the photos of smiling Americans appeared. They were part of a larger effort to control emotion itself. The Germans wanted families in the United States to see their sons alive and well, to question the truth of Allied broadcasts that spoke of hardship. It was a psychological strike aimed not at soldiers, but at mothers, fathers, and communities waiting for letters that often never came. The results were unpredictable. Some found comfort in the pictures, believing them real. Others sensed something hollow behind the smiles. The government's analysts in Washington began to study the images more closely, searching for patterns and flaws. The battle for truth had entered a new phase, one that could not be measured in victories or defeats, but in what people chose to believe. In this new kind of war, every photograph, every word printed in a newspaper became ammunition, and as the front line shifted across Europe, so did the boundaries of trust. The smiling faces from Stalag IX-B were no longer just prisoners of war. They were now the centerpiece of a global illusion, an illusion powerful enough to shape history. Inside the gray, frost-bitten fields of Stalag IX-B, a strange transformation began. The guards, who once barked orders, now moved with rehearsed calm. Shouting was replaced by soft instructions. The fences were no longer bare. Wilted flowers and tattered ribbons hung from the barbed wire, creating the illusion of peace. In a place known for hunger and despair,
The sudden color felt almost cruel. The prisoners watched in silence as workers swept the mud, painted wooden signs, and even placed benches in the open yard. Something unnatural was unfolding. In one corner of the camp, the commandant ordered the construction of what he called the film section. It wasn't large, just a few barracks and an open space carefully arranged to look orderly and clean. To the prisoners, it felt like a stage, built not for comfort, but for control. Men who were too weak to stand were hidden away behind closed doors. The rest were divided, selected like actors for a show they never agreed to perform in. Among them was Corporal Ray Holden, a 24-year-old airman from Ohio. Before the war, he had worked in the small-town photo shop, developing pictures for families and newlyweds. Now, he found himself on the other side of a camera, trapped in a nightmare that twisted everything he once understood about truth and image. The guards handed out uniforms that didn't fit. They were clean but stiff, their collars biting into thin necks. The men were told to wash, to shave, and to smile when the cameras arrived. Those who hesitated were reminded, quietly but firmly, that cooperation meant survival. Holden didn't need to be told twice. He saw the look in the eyes of the others. Everyone understood that this wasn't a request. The next morning, the visitors came. A small crew carrying film reels, notebooks, and cameras. They moved through the camp like surveyors of a strange new world. One man carried a clipboard and a smile that seemed rehearsed. Another adjusted the lighting, trying to catch the sunlight on the prisoners' faces. It was theater, disguised as evidence.
Holden stood near the fence, his hands shaking from the cold. When the photographer raised the camera, he forced a smile that didn't belong to him. The shutter clicked. The sound was sharp and final, echoing in his mind like a nail sealing the truth away. Around him, others did the same. Smiles stretched thin, eyes hollow yet obedient. Every picture was a lie, carved into film. For a brief moment, Holden tried to convince himself that maybe this could help. Maybe the photos would show the world they were alive. Maybe their families would find comfort in seeing their faces, even if the setting was false. But when he saw the guards positioning men beside piles of bread that weren't meant for them, the illusion collapsed. The food was just a prop. The flowers were just decoration. None of it was real. The filming continued for days. Each morning, new scenes were arranged. Men pretending to receive mail, playing chess, sharing meals. Holden noticed how the cameramen directed everything, even laughter. It was a grotesque performance of happiness. Behind the lenses, the truth remained locked in the hidden barracks, where the weakest lay unseen. At night, Holden sat awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could still hear the mechanical click of the shutter over and over. In that sound, he heard the deception spreading far beyond the camp. Those images would travel across Europe, then across oceans. They would be shown to families in America who would believe their sons were being treated well. Holden felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't angry, he was ashamed. The smile he had given would soon be used to comfort the very people who prayed for him. On the final day of filming, the prisoners were ordered to line up in the yard. The air was still, heavy with expectation. The photographer asked for a group shot, something to show unity. Holden stood in the front row. Behind him, hundreds of men stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on nothing. The camera flashed once, twice, 3 times. In each burst of light, Holden thought of his mother's kitchen table in Ohio, where a photograph of him in uniform still stood. He wondered if this new picture, the false one, would ever reach her hands. When the crew finally left, the camp returned to its usual silence. The flowers began to wither. The bread props disappeared. The benches were dragged away. The film section was abandoned like a forgotten set after a play. The guards no longer smiled. The old routines resumed: hard work, short rations, long nights. But something had changed. The men who had been part of the illusion now carried a heavier weight. They had seen how easily truth could be dressed up and sold. They had been turned into instruments of deception. And though they said nothing, the guilt was visible in the way they moved, in the quiet between them. Holden avoided the camera from that day on. Whenever he saw a guard raise one, he turned away. He no longer wanted his face to be part of someone's story, especially one that wasn't real. He understood that survival wasn't just about living through hunger or cold. It was about guarding the truth, even when you couldn't speak it. Inside Stalag IX-B, the illusion had ended, but far away, in warm American living rooms, the photographs began to appear. Images of smiling men behind neat fences, dressed in clean uniforms, seemingly well-fed. Families stared at them with relief. The illusion had worked, and for Corporal Ray Holden, that knowledge would linger longer than the war itself. Weeks after the cameras stopped clicking inside Stalag IX-B, the illusion began its journey beyond the wire. The film reels, carefully packed and labeled, were carried across borders under the claim of humanitarian inspection. Soon the photographs appeared in neutral European newspapers. They were printed beside headlines that spoke of humane treatment and honor among enemies. The images showed clean uniforms, soft smiles, and men appearing well-fed beneath banners of supposed goodwill. To the casual reader, they looked like proof that war still had mercy, but to those who had lived it, it was an insult painted as kindness. By the time the photographs reached American shores, they had already been reprinted, recaptioned, and reinterpreted. They landed on desks at the Office of War Information in Washington, the nerve center for America's media and morale during the war. Every day, stacks of foreign press clippings arrived for translation and analysis. Among them were the pictures from Stalag IX-B. The tone of the European papers caught attention first. "American prisoners treated with respect," one headline read. Another insisted, "proof of fair conditions in German camps." To many, it seemed harmless, but to those who had studied the enemy's propaganda tactics, the timing felt calculated. Across the country, newspapers occasionally picked up the same photographs, unknowing of their origin. Families of missing airmen found themselves frozen over breakfast tables, staring at faces that looked familiar. Some swore they saw their sons. Mothers clipped the images and sent them to military offices, pleading for confirmation. "Is this him? He looks healthy." Fathers wrote letters of cautious relief, saying maybe the rumors of harsh treatment had been exaggerated. Hope returned to homes that had been silent for months. But as hope spread, confusion followed. Reports began to conflict. Some civilians questioned whether the government had misled them about the enemy's cruelty. Rumors grew in small towns, and morale reports from across the nation reflected the unease. The photographs had done what they were meant to do. They blurred the line between truth and lie. The illusion was working. Inside a dimly lit government office in Washington, a young analyst named Margaret Leland sifted through the latest batch of foreign papers. She was 26, sharp-eyed, and quietly persistent. Her work involved scanning for patterns, details that didn't belong, inconsistencies that told a story beneath the surface. That morning, she noticed something strange. In 2 different newspapers from different countries, the same background appeared behind different groups of men, the same patch of dirt, the same fence, even the same shadow from a bent post. She leaned closer. In one photo, a man was smiling beside a loaf of bread. In another, he stood behind a chessboard. Same man, same expression, same fold in his uniform. Margaret marked the pages with a pencil. It wasn't just a recycled background. The entire scene had been staged. She began to collect more clippings. The more she compared, the clearer the pattern became. Some faces appeared 2 or 3 times, placed in different groups. Not a single image showed visible identification tags. None carried the markings required under international prisoner rules. It was as if every photo had been scrubbed clean of reality. Her findings unsettled her. These weren't just pictures, they were weapons of perception. Margaret prepared a quiet report, detailing her suspicions. It was passed through layers of desks until it reached analysts who specialized in psychological warfare. Within days, confirmation followed. Other reports showed similar images surfacing across Europe, all linked to the same source. What began as a few harmless photographs had become part of a deliberate campaign, a false portrait of compassion designed to fracture trust between the American public and its own government.
In the following weeks, counter-efforts began to form. Quiet, deliberate, unseen. Teams within the Office of War Information started tracing the network of publications printing the images. They compared them with verified accounts from liberated prisoners and Red Cross inspections. The contrast was undeniable. Behind the cheerful faces lay hunger, sickness, and despair. Yet none of that appeared in the glossy prints.
For Margaret, the discovery marked the beginning of a new kind of battle. One fought not with weapons, but with truth. Every false image that crossed her desk reminded her of the human cost behind it. She often wondered who the men in the pictures really were, and whether they knew how far their forced smiles had traveled. She imagined their families, clinging to hope built on lies, and it gave her purpose. She realized that wars could be fought in silence, in photographs, in headlines, in the space between what people wanted to believe and what was real. Within months, the government quietly countered the illusion. Reports were released emphasizing the harsh conditions confirmed by neutral observers. Subtle but firm corrections appeared in the American press. The truth began to surface again, piece by piece. Yet the damage had already left its mark. In small towns across America, some families still held on to those pictures, refusing to believe they were false. For them, those smiles meant life. And while the world moved forward, the deception of Stalag IX-B lived on in reels and clippings, a silent reminder that even in war, the battle for truth could be as powerful as the one fought with guns. Margaret Leland never met the men in the photos, but through her work, she gave their false smiles a voice and turned illusion into warning, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't what the camera shows, but what it hides. When the last camera clicked and the final flash faded, the illusion of kindness dissolved into silence. The journalists and officers who had staged the smiling spectacle at Stalag IX-B packed their equipment and left. The bright banners, the flowers woven through barbed wire, and the neatly arranged tables of food, all were gone by the next morning. The guards tore down the decorations, kicked over benches, and rolled up the cloth that had covered cracked walls. What had been built to deceive the world was dismantled overnight, as if it had never existed. The men who had stood in front of those cameras, including Corporal Ray Holden, were marched back to the far side of the camp. The smell of stew and bread that had filled the air only a day earlier was replaced by the sharp chill of empty rooms. The extra blankets vanished, the hot meals ended, and the friendly voices of guards turned cold again. The illusion had served its purpose, and now those who had made it possible were no longer needed. Holden felt the change immediately. The same officers who had smiled at him during the filming now looked through him as if he didn't exist. His body ached from exhaustion, but it was his mind that suffered most. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the camera lens staring back at him. He could still hear the click of the shutter, the sound that had captured a lie and sent it across the world. Somewhere, he thought, his mother might be holding one of those pictures, believing that her son was safe. The thought tore through him like a quiet storm. Days turned into weeks. The staged film section became a memory whispered among prisoners.
The men who had been chosen to appear in the photos were watched more closely now. They were marked as cooperative, though none of them had volunteered for it. Holden noticed that guards treated them with suspicion, sometimes resentment. It was as if the same men who had used them for propaganda now blamed them for being part of it. Every gesture of kindness felt like a setup. Every silence felt like a threat.
Food grew scarce again, and the long winter made time stretch endlessly. The men's faces grew pale, their frames thinner, their spirits quieter. Holden began to feel a new kind of guilt, the guilt of survival. He remembered the faces of those who hadn't been chosen for the photographs, men who had stood behind the wire, watching him pose with forced calm. To them, he had looked privileged, chosen, but he knew the truth. Every smile he gave had been a shield to protect others, a hope that by cooperating, someone else might be spared. Now he wasn't sure if he had saved anyone at all, or only helped spread the lie further. Late at night, Holden found ways to occupy his mind. He began writing letters home, careful and deliberate, always under the eyes of the guards. But hidden between the harmless lines of family news, he began to leave signs, tiny coded traces of truth. He wrote about the weather, using cold to describe fear and heat to describe anger. When he said the camp was bright, he meant cameras. When he mentioned flowers by the fence, he meant deception. He trusted that someone back home, perhaps his father or a friend, might sense what he was really saying. It was dangerous. Every letter was read before leaving the camp. Prisoners had been punished for less. But Holden's guilt had grown into defiance. If he couldn't break the illusion with his voice, he would do it with words hidden in plain sight. Each coded line felt like a small victory, a secret rebellion against the mask they had forced him to wear. The days dragged on. The sounds of distant engines and the low rumble of war reached the camp, but no one knew what it meant. Rumors spread that the Allies were advancing, but the guards gave nothing away. Hope came in small fragments, carried by whispers, and was gone as quickly as it appeared. Holden felt himself changing. The man who had once smiled for a false camera now spoke less, trusted no one, and kept his emotions buried deep inside. Sometimes, in the dim light of the barracks, he would think about that single photograph that had gone around the world. Somewhere in Ohio, he imagined it pinned to a wall or folded inside a letter. Maybe his mother looked at it every night before bed, finding comfort in his smile. He wanted to believe that comfort mattered, even if it was built on lies. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the photo had stolen something from him. His truth, his dignity, his reality. He had become not a person, but a picture. One evening, as the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Holden caught his reflection in a frozen window pane. The man staring back looked older, harder, more distant. He realized that the smile he once gave for the camera had stayed frozen there, not on his face, but deep inside him. It was no longer just an image. It was a memory he couldn't escape. The illusion that had begun as propaganda had turned into something far more powerful, a silent cage built from guilt and grief. And as Holden folded another coded letter, carefully signing his name beneath it, he understood that his war was no longer fought on the battlefield. It was now a war for truth, hidden beneath the thin lines of ink, carried across the ocean to a world that still believed in smiles.
In Washington, the truth finally began to surface. What had started as quiet suspicion inside a dimly lit office was turning into a full-scale counterattack, not with soldiers, but with words, proof, and exposure. The smiling faces from Stalag IX-B had done their damage. Across America, families clung to those photos as signs of hope, while others began to question what their government had been saying about the enemy. Confusion had spread like fog, and morale wavered. For the first time, the war for truth was as dangerous as the war itself. Inside the Office of War Information, analysts gathered around long tables covered in photographs, clippings, and intercepted communications. Margaret Leland's discovery of repeated faces and identical backdrops had set off an investigation that reached the highest levels. Experts compared the propaganda photos to authentic Red Cross archives. The differences were impossible to ignore. Lighting inconsistencies, mismatched uniforms, and even the same background fence appearing in multiple supposed locations confirmed what she had suspected all along. The entire display had been staged with precision, a theater built to fool the world. Evidence from newly liberated prisoners arriving from Europe began to fill the gaps. They described how, before the cameras arrived, the camp had been cleaned, the sick hidden, and the strongest men chosen to represent everyone else. Their stories aligned perfectly with what Margaret's team had uncovered. The illusion was breaking, but the challenge now was how to undo the damage already done. Across the ocean, British intelligence faced the same battle. Within the walls of the Political Warfare Executive, the British branch specializing in psychological strategy, a plan formed to turn the German deceit against itself. If propaganda was their weapon, truth would become the Allies' counterattack. The British began preparing leaflets that showed side-by-side comparisons, German photos on one side, real testimonies on the other. Each was designed to expose the lie and to reach both occupied Europe and neutral nations, still unsure which version of the war to believe. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Office of Strategic Services, America's secret intelligence arm, gathered intercepted German radio communications that confirmed what had happened. Coded reports between Berlin and the camp's officers mentioned image management, public presentation, and foreign inspection success. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. It was a confession written in plain sight. The information was compiled into a classified report titled The Fabricated Humanity of the Reich. Its conclusion was simple but devastating. The photos from Stalag IX-B were not documentation, they were performance. When the report reached the president's briefing desk, it was decided that parts of it would be released publicly. But it wasn't only about disproving the lie, it was about reclaiming trust. Soon, American newspapers began printing carefully worded statements. Evidence confirms Axis deception of POW treatment, one headline read. Official Red Cross representatives stepped forward, clarifying that their visits had been controlled and that real conditions were far worse than shown. The same smiling faces that had once comforted millions now carried a different weight. They became proof of manipulation. British air crews joined the effort, dropping thousands of leaflets across Europe that mocked the fake photos. Some leaflets even carried reprints of the original images with captions revealing their staged nature. The intention was not just to expose the truth to the German people, but to shake confidence inside the propaganda machine itself. The same illusion that once inspired control now became a source of embarrassment for those who created it. But behind the public release and printed headlines, another war quietly raged, a psychological one, fought in coded broadcasts and secret briefings. Allied radio programs began addressing families of prisoners directly, reassuring them that their government had not forgotten their sons. They explained that the enemy's deception was meant to divide faith, but that faith itself was now a weapon of resistance. The tone was calm, firm, and deeply human. Margaret Leland watched as the campaign unfolded from her desk in Washington. For months, she had studied patterns in ink and paper, faces frozen in false joy, Now, as the truth began to spread, she realized how powerful the unseen war had become. The battlefield was no longer marked by trenches or barbed wire, but by information, trust, and perception. The propaganda war had evolved into a struggle for the very definition of truth. Each side fought not just to control the world's opinion, but to control its sense of reality. Photographs, once simple pieces of evidence, had become weapons that could shape entire nations. And for every staged smile that had crossed the ocean, another message was now returning, a promise that truth, even when buried under lies, had its own way of fighting back. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, reclaiming ground mile by mile, the illusion crafted in Stalag IX-B began to crumble completely. The smiling prisoners in the photos were finally seen for what they truly were. Not actors, not propaganda symbols, but victims of a war that had reached into the human mind itself. The counter-propaganda had done more than expose a lie. It had restored belief in something far stronger than fear. The belief that honesty could still survive in a world built on deception. Back in the camp, the false calm returned like a heavy fog. The guards no longer shouted for photographs, no longer staged their rehearsed scenes of comfort. The cameras were gone, but the tension stayed. Every man knew the truth. Those smiling images would soon travel the world, showing their faces as symbols of contentment, as if their suffering had never existed. Among them, Ray Holden couldn't rest. He had seen the flashbulbs, the forced grins, the nervous eyes of men pretending to be free. He understood that silence now meant surrender, not just of body, but of truth. Days later, when a Red Cross team arrived for an inspection, a fragile sense of hope rippled through the camp. Clean uniforms appeared overnight, rations improved for a few days, and the guards stood straighter, pretending decency. To the untrained eye, it was order. To Ray, it was theater. He knew the moment was rare, a chance to reach the outside world. Every prisoner had been told to speak carefully, to show no complaint, but Ray had no intention of obeying that rule. In the dim light of the barracks, he found a scrap of paper from a food label and a stub of pencil stolen from a clerk's desk. His handwriting trembled, not from fear, but from hunger. Every word had to count. He wrote of what truly happened after the photographers left, how the men were punished for any sign of weakness, how their meals were cut again to make them compliant, how the so-called liberated smiles were forced under threat. He didn't write names, he didn't write places, only symbols, numbers, and coded patterns that could pass through sensors unnoticed. It was a message wrapped in silence, one that only a trained eye could read. When the Red Cross officers arrived, prisoners lined up, calm and obedient. Packages from abroad were distributed, tins of soup, bits of chocolate, handwritten notes from loved ones. As the guards turned their backs, Ray slid his coded note into the seam of a Red Cross wrapper meant for Switzerland. It was a desperate gamble. If caught, the consequences would have been severe. But he didn't think about that. He only thought of truth, of the millions outside who needed to know what these images truly hid. Weeks later, that note surfaced in Geneva. The Red Cross clerk who found it had seen many strange things during the war. Secret pleas, hidden names, silent cries written between lines. But this one was different. It included exact references to the fake photographs the Germans had released. The code matched Allied encryption patterns. Within days, the message reached London, then Washington. Analysts pieced it together, confirming what many had suspected. The smiling men in the propaganda photos were not proof of mercy, but evidence of manipulation. The revelation spread quietly but powerfully. American newspapers began to hint at inconsistencies in German reports. Radio broadcasts from London carried vague but firm counterclaims. Behind the headlines, a small group of intelligence officers in the Office of Strategic Services recognized what this meant. A single note, smuggled from behind wire and watchtowers, had exposed one of the enemy's most ambitious psychological campaigns. Back in the camp, Ray never knew the impact of what he had done. Days turned into weeks, then months under the same cold skies. He grew thinner, quieter, but inside his resolve burned stronger. The other men sensed it too. His silent defiance gave them something the guards couldn't see: hope. They began to resist in subtle ways, changing their posture when photographers returned, refusing to smile on command, using small gestures to reclaim their dignity. The camp had become more than a prison. It was a battlefield of truth. When the Allied command finally confirmed the authenticity of the note, they integrated it into their counter-propaganda efforts. Radio operators crafted broadcasts describing how brave prisoners had risked everything to expose falsehood. Leaflets scattered across occupied Europe told the story in coded form, never naming names, but honoring the act. Ray's courage, though unseen, had become a symbol of resistance that traveled farther than any soldier could march. The world began to understand that truth itself had become a weapon of war. The photographs once meant to deceive now carried a different message, one the enemy had never intended. They were proof not of comfort, but of endurance. Every smile in those images became a testament to survival under lies. Ray Holden's act of defiance never made headlines, but its echo reached across borders. It reminded the free world that even behind barbed wire, courage could find a way to speak. History would later record many such stories: prisoners who scratched hidden words inside packages, who risked their lives to smuggle fragments of truth beyond the walls. Together, their defiance built an invisible bridge between the captured and the free. And somewhere in that cold, gray camp, Ray sat by the dim light of dawn, unaware that his single scrap of paper had broken through the illusion. He didn't need medals or recognition. For him, the act itself was enough, a whisper of truth in a world drowning in lies. By the early months of 1945, the war was shifting faster than anyone could have imagined. Allied forces were advancing across a collapsing Germany, uncovering one hidden truth after another. As towns fell and camps were liberated, the world finally began to see what lay behind the polished images the enemy had once proudly displayed. Among the many revelations came a quiet but powerful one: the story of the smiling prisoners. Those carefully staged photographs, once broadcast across Europe as proof of mercy, were now meeting their reckoning. Liberated soldiers stepped forward, frail but unbroken, confirming what had long been suspected. They described how they had been forced to pose for cameras, how the guards had created scenes of comfort and cooperation to deceive the world. The stories were detailed, consistent, and impossible to deny. American reporters, many of them veterans themselves, began piecing together the evidence. Soon, newspapers across the country printed comparisons that stunned the public. Side-by-side images showing the propaganda smiles beside the hollow, weary faces of the same men after liberation. The contrast spoke louder than any editorial. It was a visual confession from the enemy itself. The public reaction was immediate. Outrage spread through cities and small towns alike. Families who had clung to the enemy's photographs as faint signs of mercy now saw them for what they truly were: weapons of deceit. But amid the anger came admiration. The endurance of those soldiers, the quiet courage that endured under false smiles, became a national symbol of strength. They hadn't just survived captivity, they had defeated a lie. In Washington, analysts within the propaganda division reviewed intercepted records, confirming the orchestration behind the photographs.
They traced the manipulation to a department in Berlin, a unit designed not for warfare, but for persuasion. At its center stood Dr. Heinrich Volkmann, a man who had once believed that controlling the image of war meant controlling its outcome. For years, he had engineered illusions to shape perception, using ink and camera lenses instead of bullets and bombs. Now, those illusions were unraveling before his eyes. In Berlin, as the city crumbled under constant bombardment, Volkmann watched his empire of lies collapse. The walls of his once proud office were lined with faded posters, each one now a monument to failure. Reports from the front described chaos, troops surrendering, propaganda offices abandoned, printing presses silent. The radio broadcasts he had once scripted were replaced by desperate orders from commanders trying to hold what was left. Volkmann had built his career on the belief that truth could be rewritten, that perception was stronger than reality. But now, as Allied troops approached the capital, he faced the one truth he could not reshape, the defeat of his illusion. Witness accounts from liberated camps reached neutral nations and filtered into every major Allied publication. The truth spread faster than any leaflet his team had ever printed. Each story, each testimony, was another strike against the false world he had created.
In those final days, Volkmann's colleagues abandoned their offices, burning files and photographs in frantic attempts to erase the record. But some things could not be destroyed. The captured propaganda reels, the forged news articles, the testimonies of men like Ray Holden, all of it stood as evidence that lies had limits. In one of his last recorded moments, Volkmann turned to a remaining aide and admitted what had haunted him for months. Truth, he said quietly, was a weapon they had never learned to wield. It was an admission not of military failure, but of moral collapse. As Berlin fell, the world saw the full cost of deceit. The propaganda that had once promised victory had instead hastened defeat. It had blinded a nation, wasted its faith, and exposed the emptiness beneath the slogans. For the Allies, the victory was not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of truth. The revelation of the staged photos became a case study in how honesty, once unleashed, could dismantle even the most intricate web of lies. When American newspapers later published the full story, they didn't need dramatic headlines. The images spoke for themselves. The smiling faces beside the real ones. The transformation between them was not just physical, but moral. It revealed the resilience of the human spirit under deception and the ultimate power of truth to outlast any illusion. For Ray Holden, whose coded message had helped expose the deception, history never carried his name, but his act lived on in every retelling of the story, in classrooms, documentaries, and the quiet pride of a nation that had learned what truth meant in wartime. The fall of the lie was not just Germany's defeat, it was the triumph of honesty over illusion, of conscience over control, and as the smoke lifted over a ruined Berlin, the world understood something enduring. That truth, though silent and slow, always finds its way through the rubble.
When the war finally ended, Ray Holden returned to America a quiet man. Parades filled the streets, bands played and flags waved, but inside him there was a silence that the cheering could not reach. He was home, yet not untouched. The world saw him as a survivor, a symbol of victory, but he knew he had carried home something no one could see, the weight of falsehood, the memory of smiling for a lie that had once fooled millions. In the years that followed, those photographs continued to resurface. They appeared in reports, in museums, in history books. For the public, they became reminders of how far deceit could reach. But for Holden, they were something deeper, a frozen moment that had stolen his dignity and then, unexpectedly, given it back. What once had been a symbol of manipulation was now seen as a testament to endurance. The same smile that once served propaganda had become a portrait of quiet strength. In Washington, the lessons from those events were not forgotten. Intelligence officials studied the psychological war that had unfolded,
how pictures and words could shape entire nations, how lies could travel faster than truth. It became a turning point. From those studies grew a new understanding of modern warfare, one that would define the coming decades. New branches within the government were formed, built not around weapons or machines, but around information. Analysts, linguists, and psychologists were brought together to learn how to fight deception with facts. They traced patterns, built systems, and prepared for a new kind of conflict, one fought not on battlefields, but through minds and messages. These early programs would later form the backbone of Cold War information strategy, where perception became as powerful as firepower.
Holden never took part in those efforts. He lived quietly in Ohio, working in a small print shop, far from the noise of politics. Yet, he often saw his own face printed in textbooks and war exhibits. Each time, he felt the same uneasy mix of pride and regret. Pride because the truth had finally prevailed. Regret because he knew how hard that truth had been to uncover. The smile that once betrayed him now told a different story, a story of endurance under pressure, of faith that survived captivity, and of courage that defied manipulation. Sometimes he would sit by the window, holding one of the reprinted photographs, staring at that younger version of himself. It was strange, he thought, how a single image could live two lives, first as a lie, then as proof of resilience. He had become the face of both deception and redemption. The irony wasn't lost on him, but with time he learned to accept that maybe that was what history did. It redefined meaning long after the moment had passed. As the years turned into decades, the smiling photos of the prisoners became more than just relics. They became evidence, reminders of a battle that was fought not with weapons, but with words and images. Universities studied them, intelligence schools referenced them, and journalists cited them whenever new propaganda arose in the world. Each time the images appeared, they carried Holden's silent message, that truth may bend under pressure, but it never breaks. And though his name never made it into the official records, his act, that single coded note slipped into a Red Cross parcel, had shifted the balance in a war for truth that outlasted the fighting itself. For Holden, that was enough. He had learned that survival was not only about staying alive, but about keeping one's integrity intact, even when the world demanded a smile for a lie. By the time he grew old, he no longer saw the photographs as reminders of pain. Instead, he saw them as proof that even in deception, the truth had found a way to endure. The war had ended, but the fight for honesty never would. For America, and for men like Ray Holden, that was the real legacy of those haunting smiles.